Did Keir Starmer just try to silence Britain's farmers, only to end up humiliated? One moment, the Labour leader was preaching green justice from polished podiums. The next, Britain watched as the countryside erupted in outrage. Tractors rolled into cities, and a silent judiciary sent a deafening message. Back off or watch the system crack. Starmer thought he could reshape the rules around protest, property and power. But then something happened. He never saw coming. Nigel Farage stepped in and brought the arrests to a grinding halt. Even King Charles is reportedly furious. This wasn't just a political misstep. It was a full-blown firestorm. It all began like any low-key policy rollout. Buried in legal jargon, dressed in the language of fairness and climate responsibility. Labour's new inheritance tax plan looked harmless to city elites. A 20% levy on farmland valued over £1 million. On paper, it seemed like a modest tweak. But outside Westminster's bubble, in barns and muddy fields, among the people who feed the country, it didn't feel like policy. It felt like betrayal. For Britain's farming families, that land isn't just acreage. It's legacy. It's bloodline. Passed from grandfathers to sons, mothers to daughters. It's their livelihood, their identity, their history. And now Labour wanted a slice, a big one. Under the new proposal, if a farmer died, their children wouldn't inherit a way of life. They'd inherit debt. They'd be forced to sell or risk losing everything. Starmer and his team may have called it reform, but to the countryside it was outright theft. And it didn't stop there. As news of the tax spread, rural Britain stirred. What began as quiet concern quickly became outrage. Then the tractors rolled out, blocking Parliament Square, Labour HQ and major highways across the Midlands and the South. Farmers abandoned fields and took to the streets, not with violence, but with protest. Banners waving, harvests dumped outside Labour offices. Their signs said it all. No farmers, no food. Tax our land, starve your nation. Starmer panicked. Instead of listening, he clamped down. Instead of talking, he brought in the police. Dialogue gave way to crackdown. Peaceful farmers were suddenly branded agitators. Rural leaders found themselves under surveillance. Police began collecting names, tapping phones and preparing charges. Behind closed doors, Labour officials whispered about strategic arrests. Protest organisers, some in their 60s, were issued quiet warnings, step back or be dragged away. Starmer hadn't just lost the countryside, he'd declared war on it. That's when the judiciary stirred. And that's when the resistance found its face. Amid the chaos of panic policing, someone stepped into the spotlight. Not from Labour, not from the Tories, but from the populist fringe Labour loathes and fears, Nigel Farage. Farage didn't tiptoe into this fight. He stormed in. While Starmer's team scrambled to control the narrative, trying to label protesting farmers as dangerous agitators, Farage took to the airwaves and ripped the mask off. No soft words, no filters. On GB News, at Reform UK rallies, across every platform that would give him airtime, he called out the operation for what it was, a government-led crackdown on dissent, dressed up as climate reform. This is a war on the countryside, he said. Economic cleansing, a state-led purge of the very people who feed this country. And the country listened, because while Labour tried to criminalise tractors and paint farmers as radicals, Farage was calling it what ordinary Brits could plainly see. It was theft. It was silencing. It was the machinery of state power spinning wildly out of control. Then something extraordinary happened, something Labour never saw coming. The resistance jumped the fence from protest to power. While Farage lit the fire publicly, something else was happening behind the scenes. A quieter, more dangerous rebellion was brewing, one that struck at the very foundation of Labour's control. Inside the judiciary, a silent but seismic revolt began. Leaks trickled out from high-level legal offices. Insiders revealed that senior judges were deeply disturbed by what they were witnessing. One particularly damning leak exposed a warning from a top legal figure, anonymous for now, but unmistakably connected. His message to Labour was blunt. What you're doing is unconstitutional, unlawful and dangerous. Arresting farmers for protesting attacks, tapping their phones, tracking their movements, even preparing to detain organisers preemptively. This wasn't law, this was tyranny. The leaked phrase that echoed across every newsroom hit like a thunderclap. Gross abuse of power? And that wasn't coming from a rival party. That was the judiciary. The very institution responsible for upholding the law was now turning on the very people who claimed to write it. Labour had gone too far, and the checks and balances Keir Starmer had counted on to remain silent were finally snapping into place. But Starmer, rattled and cornered, didn't stop. He doubled down, talking about climate justice, long-term responsibility, and rebalancing the system. But it was too late. His words didn't match his actions. While he spoke of fairness, farmers were being detained. While he preached compassion, elderly landowners were being interrogated. While he celebrated clean energy goals, riot vans were rolling into peaceful rural communities. And when journalists pushed for answers, Labour's response was cold and rehearsed. We are protecting the public, but the public didn't need protecting from farmers. They needed protecting from the government. And that's when Nigel Farage made his move and turned a protest into a full-blown political uprising. He didn't just criticise, he mobilised. Reform UK sent legal observers to monitor police at protests. They launched a hotline for farmers under pressure. They published every leaked memo, every judicial warning, every internal Labour communication that exposed what was really going on. Suddenly, what Labour thought would be a quiet suppression campaign exploded into a political earthquake. Journalists who once ignored rural issues began digging. Civil liberties groups raised red flags. Even Labour-friendly media figures started asking uncomfortable questions. Inside the party, panic was spreading. Rural Labour MPs, few as they were, began to whisper. Backbenchers sent cautious messages to journalists. Some even reached out to Reform UK figures for private, off-the-record talks. The cracks were widening, and the truth was undeniable. Labour had crossed a line. And once the party that claimed to stand for fairness turned its back on the people who grow the food, till the land, and carry generations of tradition, there was no coming back. Starmer's carefully built image began to fall apart. His polished speeches, his loyally calm, his moderate persona, it all collapsed under the weight of protest signs, rubber tractor tyres, and leaked indictments. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. And what the public saw beneath wasn't a calm reformer. It was a desperate technocrat, clinging to power while the country slipped from his grasp. And Farage, he didn't just support the fight, he took it over. The countryside didn't calm down, it rose. By the third week, this wasn't just a scattered protest. It was a nationwide movement. Roads were blocked, towns were jammed. Gridlock stretched from Kent to Norfolk, from Wales to Scotland. Some farmers drove 10 hours overnight just to be seen. Villages stood still as farmers left their work and stood on the front lines, not with violence, but with pride. Their message was simple. If you tax our land, you starve your nation. And the nation finally started to listen. Fields went untended. Livestock were left to roam. Because now this wasn't just about crops or cattle, it was bigger. It was about survival, about dignity, about not being treated like criminals by the very people who claimed to represent them. And this time, the country listened. Not just the countryside, the nation. Videos of elderly farmers being dragged away went viral. Footage of Labour staffers sneering at rural reactionaries hit the headlines. And when internal Labour memos surfaced calling the farmers security risks and uncooperative assets, the backlash was instant. Reform UK's phone lines were flooded. Local councils across the South and Midlands began facing protests of their own. And then came the real blow. Labour's rural councillors began resigning, quietly at first, then publicly. One by one, they issued long, blistering statements denouncing what they called a betrayal. Some switched to independent status. A few outright defected to Reform UK. Starmer tried damage control, press conferences, scripted appeals, soft, measured language about dialogue and mutual respect. But none of it worked. Because the images told a different story. Farmers being kettled by riot police, protesters photographed without warrants, legal observers blocked from protest zones. This was no longer a policy dispute. It was a siege. And every time Labour tried to calm the public with words, the machinery of state repression exposed the truth. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage was everywhere. At a protest outside Leeds, he stood atop a hay bale, megaphone in hand, thundering, "You grow the food and they treat you like criminals. No more." On national radio, he grilled Labour spokespeople into silence. On GB News, night after night, he exposed the surveillance operations, the internal communications, the gag orders placed on dissenting officers. He wasn't just outraged, he was armed with receipts. And the public noticed. Polls didn't just shift, they surged. Reform UK, once dismissed as a fringe protest party, was rising fast. Among rural voters, small business owners, even disillusioned Labour moderates who'd finally had enough. And then came the hammer blow. A secret document, prepared by Labour's own legal counsel for Starmer's cabinet, was leaked. It warned of serious legal risks tied to the arrests. It cited potential breaches of human rights law and raised alarms about politically motivated policing. But one phrase hit hardest: pattern of authoritarian behaviour inconsistent with democratic standards. That document was never meant to see daylight. But Farage got it, and he read it live on air. The silence from Labour was deafening. And just like that, the protests became something else entirely. They became a movement, no longer just about tax or farming. Now it was about something deeper. It was about standing up to top-down control, to technocratic arrogance, to a party that once fought for workers and now surveilled them, arrested them and labelled them threats. Town halls across the UK began holding emergency meetings. Villages passed symbolic motions of no confidence in Labour governance. A group of young farmers launched a grassroots digital campaign titled "We Are Not Your Subjects." It exploded online, millions of views in days, flooding social media with raw defiance, rural solidarity and righteous anger. Meanwhile, inside Labour HQ, the atmosphere was bunker-like. Leaks revealed Starmer was furious, isolated and losing control. Some senior staff urged him to walk back the tax. Others pushed for harsher crackdowns. And the result? Paralysis. A government that had lost the room and a movement that wasn't backing down. The police had already begun assembling names, tapping phones and drafting charges. Behind locked doors, Labour officials whispered of strategic arrests. Older protest organisers, some in their 60s, were warned outright. Back down or be dragged out. Starmer hadn't just lost the countryside, he had declared war on it. That's when the judiciary stirred, and the resistance found a face. Not from Labour, not from the Tories, but from the populist fringe Labour feared most. Nigel Farage. He didn't walk into the fight, he stormed in. While Starmer's team scrambled to control the narrative, to smear protesting farmers as unruly extremists, Farage took to every platform that would have him. On GB News, at Reform UK rallies, across social media, he exposed the crackdown for what it really was: state suppression of dissent, wrapped in climate policy. "This is a war on the countryside," he said, "an economic purge of the people who feed us." And the nation listened. While Labour tried to rebrand tractors as threats, Farage called it like it was: theft, suppression, power gone rogue. That's when the protest transformed into something bigger. Quiet whispers behind courtroom doors turned into a judicial mutiny. Leaks began trickling from top legal offices, whispers of horror and disbelief. One damning revelation came from a high-level legal insider who remained anonymous, for now. Back in the fields, farms were left untended. Livestock roamed without care. Because this fight was no longer just about tax. It was about dignity, about survival, about not being treated like criminals by the very politicians who once claimed to represent them. The anger was contagious. Elderly farmers being dragged from protests made viral headlines. Labour staff mocking rural reactionaries turned into front-page scandals. Then came the internal memos, Labour classifying farmers as security risks and non-cooperative assets. The backlash was immediate. Reform UK's phone lines lit up. Rural councils faced protests of their own. Labour's rural councillors began resigning, first quietly, then with public blistering statements. Some went independent, others joined Reform UK outright. Starmer tried to stop the bleeding, press conferences, polished appeals, talks of mutual respect. But the footage told the real story. Kettled farmers, warrantless surveillance, legal observers blocked from protest zones. This wasn't de-escalation, it was a siege. And each attempt to pacify the outrage only exposed Labour's hypocrisy. Meanwhile, Farage was everywhere, standing atop hay bales with a megaphone declaring, "You grow the food and they treat you like criminals." On national radio, hammering Labour spokespeople into silence. On GB News, night after night, dropping bombshells, surveillance programmes, gag orders, internal communications. He wasn't just angry, he came armed with receipts. And the public noticed. Poll numbers shifted, fast. Reform UK surged, especially among rural voters, small business owners, and disillusioned Labour moderates. Then came the bombshell. Labour's internal legal briefing was leaked. Private, confidential, damning. It warned of human rights violations, political targeting, and a pattern of authoritarian behaviour inconsistent with democratic standards. Farage read it live on air. The silence from Labour was deafening. And just like that, the protests became a movement. No longer about farming or tax. This was now about top-down control. about a party that once fought for workers, now surveilling and criminalising them. Town halls held emergency meetings. Villages passed no-confidence motions. A group of young farmers launched a digital campaign. "We are not your subjects." It went viral, millions of views uniting voices in defiance and rural rage. Inside Labour HQ, chaos reigned. Starmer was furious, isolated, losing grip. Advisors split, some begging for a U-turn, others demanding an iron fist. And the result? Paralysis. Starmer was boxed in. By his policies, by his image, by a rebellion he could neither crush nor calm. Into that leadership vacuum stepped Farage, fully. No longer just a critic, but a commander. He didn't just oppose Labour's plans, he offered a platform. Repeal the tax, suspend climate-linked regulations, introduce a Rural Sovereignty Act to protect the land, the people, and the right to protest. This wasn't about Labour anymore, this was about Britain's soul, about who decides the future, elite technocrats with spreadsheets and carbon targets, or the hands that dig, sow, and feed the nation. Farage made it clear, Labour had picked their side, and now the people were picking theirs. It was supposed to be a quiet reform, a green initiative, a tax tweak. That's how Starmer's team had pitched it. Progressive, sensible, modern. But it ended in riot vans, court leaks, mass resignations, a media wildfire, and a public awakening that shattered Labour's image beyond recognition. And in the heart of the storm, on back roads, in crowded fields, on Parliament's doorstep, stood Nigel Farage, holding the line. As tractors continued blockading routes into London, Starmer faced pressure from every side. Even police unions grew uneasy. Officers leaked audio and body cam footage revealing chilling orders. Prioritise optics over fairness. Contain visible dissent, one supervisor was heard saying, especially near media. The backlash was instant. This wasn't just suppression, it was manipulation. Targeting peaceful protesters as part of a calculated strategy, not for safety or law, but pure image control. Labour looked less like a party and more like a regime. Behind the scenes, Labour descended into infighting, screaming matches, strategic paralysis. Starmer, once hailed as calm and competent, now looked broken. His leadership, built on control and credibility, crumbled in real time. When Britain cried out for calm, he brought crackdowns. When they asked for dialogue, he delivered surveillance. When the nation's most honest workers stood up for their dignity, he sent in the state. Internal polling revealed a nightmare. Rural support collapsing, Reform UK up 10 points in key battlegrounds. But worse, many voters weren't flipping, they were walking away entirely. "We've woken up the countryside, and they won't forget," said one Labour strategist. And they didn't. While Labour scrambled with focus groups and tepid promises to review the tax, Farage went straight to the people, town by town, county by county, listening, not lecturing, speaking plainly, repeating one message again and again. This is about control. Who owns your land? Who decides your future? And who gets silenced when they speak up? This wasn't a campaign anymore. It was a revolt. And then came the final blow. A retired High Court justice went public. No leaks, no anonymity. In a letter published across major newspapers, he condemned the government's use of police against farmers as a dangerous erosion of civil liberties in the name of ideological control. Labour thought they were managing a policy. They had ignited a revolution. Starmer was trapped by his own policies, by his own image, and by a revolt he could neither crush nor calm. In that leadership vacuum, Nigel Farage stepped in. Not just as a critic, but as a commander. He didn't just oppose Labour's plan. He laid out a bold, disruptive vision. A total repeal of the farmland inheritance tax, suspension of all climate-linked regulations until a national referendum could be held, and a Rural Sovereignty Act to protect farmers' rights to land, protest and property. He wasn't feeding the fire. He was building a platform on it. Because this wasn't just about Labour anymore. It was about the soul of Britain. About who gets to define the future of the country. Elites armed with spreadsheets and carbon targets, or the people who dig, plant, build and feed the nation. Farage made it clear, Labour had chosen its side. And now the people were choosing theirs. What was pitched as a quiet reform, a green initiative, a minor tax adjustment, turned into chaos. Riot vans on the streets, judicial revolts, mass resignations, media meltdowns, and a public awakening that shattered Labour's image beyond recognition. And in the middle of it all, across cracked village roads, In banner-filled fields, on the steps of Parliament, and in every digital space, stood Farage, holding the line while Labour watched its narrative burn. Inside Labour HQ, chaos spread like rot. Strategy meetings dissolved into shouting matches. Senior advisors were split. Some urged an apology, others insisted on standing firm. Starmer, once the calm adult in the room after Tory dysfunction, now appeared rattled, indecisive, and distant. The illusion of competence shattered. When Britain needed calm, he delivered crackdowns. When citizens asked for dialogue, he gave them surveillance. When the nation's most honest workers stood to defend their families, he sent the state to break them.